What's the craziest weather-related disaster that happened during a wedding? Story 1. It was supposed to be the perfect wedding. An intimate beach ceremony, a golden sunset, and the sound of waves in the background. Alice and Jacob had planned every detail, and the weather forecast promised clear skies. As guests took their seats under a floral arch, a light breeze rustled through. The officiant joked that nature itself was celebrating their love. No one paid attention to the dark cloud forming on the horizon. Minutes later, everything changed. The wind picked up, the ocean grew restless, and a sudden waterspout formed offshore. What started as a gentle breeze turned into chaos. Tablecloths flew, chairs tumbled, and a loud crash signaled that the wedding cake had just become airborne. Then, Jacob vanished. A powerful gust lifted him off the ground, sending him tumbling across the sand before anyone could react. Screams filled the air as guests scrambled for cover, diving behind overturned tables and bushes. Alice, in her soaked wedding dress, searched frantically, calling his name. For 10 agonizing minutes, the storm raged, and when it finally settled, someone pointed at a nearby tree. There, dangling from the branches 50 meters away, was Jacob. His tuxedo was torn, his hair a wild mess, but he was alive. After rescuing him, the couple decided to continue the ceremony, indoors this time. When the officiant asked, "Do you take each other in joy and in storm?" Jacob laughed and said, "We already survived the storm, so yes." And that's how their wedding became legendary. Story 2. The wedding was set in a picturesque countryside vineyard with rolling hills and a golden sunset promising a dreamlike evening. Olivia and Ethan had planned every detail: rustic wooden tables, fairy lights, and an outdoor dance floor under the stars. It was supposed to be magical, and it was, until the hailstorm from hell arrived. The ceremony had just ended, and guests were raising their glasses for the first toast when the temperature suddenly dropped. A sharp gust of wind sent napkins flying, and a distant rumble of thunder rolled across the valley. The sky, once a soft pastel pink, turned an eerie shade of gray. Then came the first hailstone. It plopped onto the dance floor with an innocent little thud. Then another, and another. Within seconds, chunks of ice the size of golf balls rained down on the wedding. Guests screamed, shielding their heads with plates, purses, anything they could grab. The once peaceful vineyard transformed into a war zone of ice. Ethan, in full groom mode, grabbed Olivia's hand and yelled for everyone to run toward the tent. But the tent didn't survive. With a deafening rip, a massive gust of wind lifted the entire tent like a parachute and sent it soaring into the vineyard. It crashed straight into the wedding cake, launching frosting and decorations in every direction. Olivia gasped as she watched her 5-tiered masterpiece collapse into a sad, sugary mess. Meanwhile, the DJ, determined to keep spirits high, shouted, "Well, folks, looks like Mother Nature wants a dance battle." And somehow that was all it took. Instead of running for cover, some guests started dancing in the hail, using serving trays as shields. Someone grabbed a microphone and turned it into an impromptu karaoke session. Ethan took off his jacket and covered Olivia with it, laughing as they twirled around the slippery dance. By the time the hailstorm passed, everyone was soaked, bruised, and covered in cake. But instead of ruining the wedding, it made it unforgettable. Later that night, when a guest asked Olivia how she felt about the disaster, she grinned and said, "If we can survive this, we can survive anything." Story 3. The wedding was set in a breathtaking mountaintop lodge, surrounded by towering pines and a view that stretched for miles. Emma and Ryan had chosen the location for its peaceful, storybook charm, completely unaware that nature had its own plans. The day started off perfect. Guests arrived, admiring the view while sipping champagne. The ceremony went smoothly, with Emma and Ryan exchanging heartfelt vows under a canopy of twinkling lights. But just as they sealed their marriage with a kiss, the ground shook. At first, it was subtle, just a faint rumble beneath their feet. Some guests thought it was distant thunder. Others assumed it was just their excitement. But within seconds, the shaking intensified. Glasses rattled, chairs wobbled, and then, boom! A powerful tremor sent the entire wedding party screaming and running for cover. An earthquake. The officiant dove under the table. The cake toppled in slow motion, landing face first onto the dance. The DJ abandoned his booth, leaving the speakers blaring an awkwardly upbeat song as guests scrambled. Plates shattered. A chandelier swung violently overhead. And then, the real nightmare began. A rock slide. High above, loosened by the quake, a cascade of boulders began tumbling down the mountain. The sound was deafening. Dust filled the air as the guests ran for their lives. Ryan, still gripping Emma's hand, spotted a small wooden cabin nearby and shouted, "Go, go, go!" With hearts pounding, they sprinted inside just as the first massive rock crashed into the reception area, flattening what had once been a beautifully decorated dining space. Plates, flowers, and candles flew in all directions. It was chaos. For a few terrifying minutes, no one knew if the lodge would withstand the impact. But then, as quickly as it had started, the rumbling stopped. Silence. When the dust settled, guests cautiously emerged, coughing but miraculously unharmed. The wedding area was destroyed, but the lodge itself had survived. And standing in the middle of the wreckage, still gripping his bride's hand, Ryan took a deep breath and grinned. Well, that was one hell of a reception. Everyone burst into nervous laughter. The bartender, ever the professional, dusted off his counter, poured a round of shots and said, "So, still want that toast?" Emma and Ryan looked at each other, then raised their glasses. The wedding wasn't what they had planned, but it was one they would never forget. Story 4. The wedding was set in a charming lakeside venue, with the ceremony planned right at the water's edge. Lily and Mark had dreamed of a peaceful, romantic setting, fairy lights, soft music, and a gentle breeze off the lake. It was perfect, until the fog rolled in. At first, it was barely noticeable, a light mist hovering over the water. Guests even commented on how mystical it looked, like something out of a fairy tale. But within minutes, the mist thickened, swallowing the trees, the shoreline, and then the wedding itself. By the time Lily started walking down the aisle, she could barely see 2 feet ahead of her. The guests vanished in the fog. The groom, now just a vague silhouette at the altar. Whispers filled the air. Is this part of the ceremony? Where did everyone go? Then came the real problem. The boat. Behind them, the lake was completely hidden in the fog. No one noticed that a small, driverless boat had come loose from the dock and was drifting straight toward the wedding platform. The guests couldn't see it. The couple couldn't see it. But they heard it, a low, eerie creaking of wood cutting through the silence. Then, crash! The boat slammed into the dock, knocking over a decorative arch. A chain reaction followed. The arch fell onto the sound system, sending a loud bang through the speakers. A guest screamed. Someone tripped. Someone else fell directly into the lake. Now, full-on panic erupted. People ran in random directions, crashing into chairs, tables, and each other, completely blinded by the thick fog. The officiant, now totally lost, accidentally started reading vows to the wrong couple. Meanwhile, Lily, determined to find Mark, wandered forward, only to step onto the loose dockboard. With a loud snap, it gave way, and she plunged straight into the freezing lake. A moment of silence. Then, Lily! Someone get her! Mark, still unable to see a thing, lunged toward the splash, miscalculated, and fell in right after her. Now the bride and groom were both soaking wet, treading water, and laughing hysterically. When the fog finally cleared, the venue looked like a disaster zone. Soggy guests, broken chairs, and a very wet bride and groom standing at the water's edge, dripping and shivering. But instead of crying, Lily grabbed the microphone and announced, "Well, we wanted a wedding to remember." And as the guests cheered, Mark took her hand, grinned, and said, "Let's get married before a tornado shows up." Story 5. The wedding was set in a beautiful desert resort, surrounded by towering red rock formations and an endless blue sky. Mia and Lucas had chosen this location for its breathtaking scenery and warm golden sunset. The weather forecast promised a perfect day. Clear skies, no wind, and just the right amount of sunshine. They had no idea that a sandstorm was on its way. The ceremony started off smoothly. Mia walked down the aisle, her veil flowing behind her, as guests wiped away happy tears. Lucas beamed at her. Everything felt like a dream. But just as they exchanged rings, a distant howl echoed through the valley. The officiant paused. The guests glanced around. Then someone pointed toward the horizon. A massive wall of sand was rolling toward them. Within seconds, the gentle breeze turned into a fierce wind, sending flower petals and decorations flying. A gust ripped Mia's veil right off her head, launching it into the air like a ghostly parachute. Guests started shielding their eyes, sand stinging their skin. Then, boom! The reception tent collapsed in a flurry of fabric and tangled string lights. Chaos erupted. People ran for cover, diving behind tables and chairs. Plates shattered. The wedding cake, 3 tiers of perfection, launched sideways, landing face first on the best man. Lucas grabbed Mia's hand and yelled, "We need to get inside!" But where was the officiant? Through the swirling dust, they saw him clutching the marriage certificate, blindly stumbling toward the wrong direction, straight into a cactus. Mia, still barefoot from the ceremony, was dragged by the wind, her dress flaring out like a parachute. Lucas lunged forward, grabbing her waist just before she could tumble into the buffet table. Somewhere in the madness, the DJ decided there was only one thing to do: keep the party going. Over the howling wind, the speakers blasted, "I Will Survive." And somehow, that was enough. The guests, instead of panicking, started dancing in the storm. Mia and Lucas, covered in sand, looked at each other, shrugged, and joined them. By the time the sandstorm passed, everyone was dusty, exhausted, and absolutely hysterical with laughter. The reception area was a mess. The food was ruined. But the love? Stronger than ever, someone handed Mia a microphone. She brushed the sand from her hair, turned to Lucas and said, well, if we can survive this, marriage should be easy." And with that, the party officially began. Story 6. The wedding was set in a stunning cliffside villa overlooking the endless ocean. Amelia and Jack had always dreamed of a seaside ceremony, with waves crashing below and the sun setting in the background. Everything was perfect, until the seagulls attacked. It started off subtly. A few birds circled overhead as guests arrived, their white wings blending with the decorations. No one paid much attention. But the moment the food was brought out, everything changed. A single, bold seagull swooped down and snatched a canapé right from a guest's hand. The crowd gasped, but before anyone could react, dozens more appeared. It was an invasion. Seagulls dived onto the appetizer table, knocking over glasses and sending shrimp cocktails. Guests screamed and ducked as birds stole napkins, pecked at bread rolls, and flapped wildly through the air. Then, disaster struck. The wedding cake, a masterpiece of delicate sugar flowers, stood proudly on its display. One particularly ambitious seagull landed right on top of it. The stand wobbled. The guests gasped in horror. And then, crack! The three-tiered cake tumbled off the table, splattering onto the floor as seagulls swarmed like a scene from a horror movie. Amelia, in her pristine white gown, turned just in time to see a full slice of cake land directly on Jack's face. For a moment, there was silence. Then Jack licked the frosting off his lips, grinned, and said, "At least it tastes good." The entire wedding erupted in laughter. A waiter, in a desperate attempt to save the day, grabbed a loaf of bread and threw it off the cliff. The seagulls immediately took the bait and chased after it, leaving the wedding in peace at last. With the chaos finally over, Amelia shook her head, wiped some frosting off Jack's suit, and said, "I guess this is the universe's way of making sure we never forget this day." And instead of mourning the lost cake, they had the best first dance ever, covered in frosting, laughing, and completely in love. Story 7. The wedding was set on a gorgeous private island, with golden sand, crystal clear waters, and palm trees swaying in the breeze. Sophie and Daniel had chosen this paradise for their special day, imagining a romantic, stress-free ceremony. But Mother Nature had other plans. Just as the guests took their seats, a local fisherman ran up to the wedding planner, waving his arms frantically. He pointed toward the ocean, shouting something in a thick accent. No one could understand him, until they saw it. A tsunami warning. At first, it didn't seem real. The ocean looked calm, the sky was still blue. But then, in the distance, the waterline began pulling back. The guests gasped. The wedding planner turned pale. And then someone screamed, "Run!" What had been a peaceful beach wedding instantly turned into mass chaos. Bridesmaids in high heels sprinted through the sand, tripping over decorations. The groom's grandfather, determined not to leave behind his champagne, waddled after the crowd, holding 2 full glasses. The flower girl, bless her heart, stood frozen in confusion until the best man scooped her up and bolted toward higher ground. Meanwhile, Sophie, still in her massive wedding dress, was trying to run, but the layers of fabric acted like a parachute. Every step got harder. The wind picked up. The waterline kept receding. Daniel turned back, saw his bride struggling, and without hesitation threw her over his shoulder. "This is not how I imagined the honeymoon starting," she shouted as he ran. By the time they reached a hill overlooking the beach, the water that had pulled back came surging forward in a monstrous wave. It smashed through the wedding setup, sweeping away the altar, the reception tables, and, tragically, the cake. For a moment, everyone just stood in shock. Their dream wedding had been wiped out in seconds. But then, Daniel caught his breath, looked at Sophie, and grinned. "Well, guess that means we're married by water now." The guests, still panting, burst into laughter. Someone pulled out a bottle of champagne that had miraculously survived. The best man grabbed his phone, pulled up a wedding march, and the officiant, now barefoot and covered in sand, finished the ceremony right there on the hill. With no decorations, no music, and no fancy setup, Sophie and Daniel said, "I do," with nothing but the sunset behind them and the sound of waves crashing below. And in the end, it was still the most unforgettable wedding ever. Story 8. The wedding was set in a breathtaking meadow, surrounded by wildflowers and towering mountains. Ella and Nathan had envisioned a peaceful outdoor ceremony filled with fresh air, sunshine, and the soft chirping of birds. It was a picture-perfect setting until the cows arrived. It started with just one. A single, curious brown cow appeared from the nearby pasture, strolling lazily toward the wedding. The guests chuckled as it sniffed the flower arrangements, seemingly enjoying the decorations. Then came 5 more. Within minutes, an entire herd of 20 massive cows had wandered into the wedding area, weaving between the chairs and sniffing at the guests' outfits. One particularly bold cow tried to eat the flower girl's basket. Ella's mother gasped, "Oh no, do something!" But before anyone could react, chaos erupted. One of the groomsmen made the mistake of waving his arms to shoo them away. The cows, startled, took this as a signal to charge, straight toward the buffet table. Guests screamed as the animals barreled through the beautifully arranged dishes. Plates clattered, champagne glasses tipped over, and the carefully roasted appetizers devoured. Meanwhile, Nathan tried to keep the officiant calm. "It's fine. Let's just get married fast." But then, disaster struck. One cow, seemingly unimpressed by the vows, stepped directly onto Ella's dress. The delicate lace tore with a loud RIP, sending her into a near meltdown. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get worse, one guest, a city guy with zero farm experience, screamed and ran, causing the cows to stampede. Now, fully panicked, they galloped through the reception area, knocking over chairs and guests alike. The wedding cake? Gone in a single headbutt. Ella, catching her breath, turned to Nathan. "Are we seriously being outwitted by cows?" Nathan, looking at the destruction around them, sighed and said, "Well, they are crashers, but at least they didn't object." The guests, covered in frosting and trampled flowers, burst into laughter. The cows, now bored, wandered off as quickly as they had come. And despite the chaos, the couple finished their vows standing in the middle of a half-destroyed wedding setup. No fancy cake, no perfect decorations, just love, laughter, and one wild wedding story. Story 9. The wedding was set in a breathtaking forest clearing with twinkling fairy lights strung between towering oak trees. Emily and Jake had chosen this magical spot for their big day, imagining a peaceful, intimate ceremony surrounded by nature. But nature had other plans. The day had been perfect so far. Guests arrived, admired the decorations, and took their seats as the sun filtered through the leaves. Emily walked down the aisle, looking like a true woodland princess. Everything was straight out of a fairy tale, until the bees arrived. It started with just one, a single, curious bee that hovered near the bouquet. No big deal. The maid of honor casually waved it away. Then came more. Dozens. Suddenly, an entire swarm of bees buzzed into the clearing, drawn by the sweet scent of the flowers and, unfortunately, the wedding cake sitting nearby. The officiant tried to keep things moving. "Do you, Jake, take Emily?" But Jake was already swatting wildly, his face twisted in panic as bees zoomed around him. Then, full-on chaos. The best man took off running, arms flailing. The flower girl screamed and threw her basket in the air. One guest, in a blind panic, jumped straight into the punch bowl. Emily, trying to remain calm, froze in horror as a bee landed right on her nose. Jake, thinking fast, attempted to flick it away and accidentally smacked her in the face. The crowd gasped. Emily, stunned, looked at Jake with wide eyes. "Did you just slap me at our wedding?" Before he could explain, the swarm descended upon the cake. The guests watched in terror as the beautiful 3-tiered masterpiece was overrun. A single bee sting to the chef's hand sent him running, knocking over the entire table. The cake toppled, splattering onto the grass in a sugary explosion. Emily, still recovering from the slap, turned to Jake and said, "This is a disaster." Jake, now covered in frosting and bee stings, grinned and said, "At least we know this marriage will be buzzing with excitement." The guests, still half panicked, couldn't help but burst into laughter. Eventually, the bees lost interest and flew away, leaving behind a sticky, stunned, but hysterically laughing wedding party. With the reception area in ruins and guests picking frosting out of their hair, Emily sighed and took Jake's hand. "Let's finish this before a bear shows up." And with that, they officially became husband and wife, battle-tested and bee-approved. Story 10. The wedding was set in a charming old castle with ivy-covered walls and candlelit halls that gave it the feel of a real-life fairy tale. Isabella and Daniel had chosen this venue for its history, elegance, and romance. They hadn't counted on the ghost. The ceremony was flawless. Teary vows, a stunning sunset, and a warm breeze drifting through the castle courtyard. Guests clinked glasses, toasts were made, and the reception officially began inside the grand banquet hall. And then, the chandelier flickered. At first, No one thought much of it. It was an old castle, after all. But then, as the newlyweds took their first dance, the lights flickered again and went out completely. Gasps filled the hall. Candles cast eerie shadows on the stone walls. Then came the whispering. A soft, chilling murmur swept through the room, as if the castle itself was speaking. Guests shuddered, looking around nervously. And then, bang! A gust of icy wind slammed the doors shut. Screams erupted as one of the paintings on the wall crashed to the floor. "Okay, who invited the ghost?" shouted Daniel's best man. A waiter, pale as a sheet, stammered, "To the castle. It's haunted. Lady Eleanor, she doesn't like weddings." Isabella blinked. Excuse me, who doesn't like weddings?" The waiter gulped. "The ghost, Lady Eleanor. Legend says she was left at the altar centuries ago and, well, she hates happy couples." At that moment, a chair slid across the floor on its own. Total panic. Guests ran for the doors. Someone tried climbing out a window. The DJ, in a desperate attempt to break the tension, blasted upbeat music, but the speakers exploded in sparks. Isabella, still in shock, turned to Daniel. "So, do we just leave?" Daniel, ever the problem solver, grabbed a glass of champagne, raised it toward the ceiling, and shouted, To Lady Eleanor, you're welcome to stay, but please don't ruin the cake." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the candles calmed, the whispers faded, and the temperature returned to normal. The ghost, it seemed, had accepted the offer. With nervous laughter, guests returned to their seats. The music started again, and as Isabella and Daniel finally cut their cake, the chandelier flickered one last time, as if Lady Eleanor was watching. And maybe, just maybe, she was. Story 11. The wedding was set on a breathtaking cruise ship, sailing through crystal-clear waters under a sky painted with a golden sunset. Anna and Michael had chosen this unique venue to make their special day feel like a dream, romantic, unforgettable, and surrounded by nothing but the endless ocean. They hadn't planned for a rogue wave. The ceremony had just finished, and the couple was enjoying their first toast as husband and wife. Guests clapped, champagne sparkled, and the ship's gentle rocking added to the charm of the moment. Then, without warning, the ship lurched violently to the side. Glasses tipped over. Chairs scraped across the deck. Guests gasped and grabbed whatever they could to steady themselves. The DJ's carefully arranged playlist skipped, blaring a distorted note before shutting off completely. The bride's bouquet flew straight into the ocean. For a moment, silence. Then, another massive tilt. One guest, trying to save his plate of shrimp, accidentally flung it into the air. The shrimp landed directly on the bride's head. Screams, laughter, chaos. And then, the cake. A towering, five-tiered masterpiece positioned beautifully at the center of the deck. As the ship tilted again, the table beneath it slid, in horrifying slow motion toward the edge. The entire wedding party watched in shock. Anna, still with a shrimp in her hair, yelled, "Somebody save the cake!" Michael lunged forward. The best man dived. The guests reached out desperately. Too late. The cake soared off the deck, flipping twice before landing with a perfect splash into the ocean. For a moment, all anyone could do was stare at the rippling water. Then the best man, now lying flat on his stomach from the failed rescue attempt, muttered, "Well, at least the fish get dessert." That was all it took. The wedding party burst into laughter. Even Anna, still picking shrimp out of her veil, couldn't help but laugh until she cried. The ship steadied. The champagne flowed again. And when someone finally brought out a tiny backup cake, Anna and Michael cut it with seawater in their hair and the biggest smiles on their faces. Their wedding wasn't perfect, but it was legendary. Story 12. The wedding was set in a gorgeous open field, surrounded by blooming sunflowers and rolling hills. Olivia and James had chosen this spot because of its natural beauty. Golden flowers swaying in the breeze, a bright blue sky, and a stunning sunset planned as the backdrop to their vows. What they hadn't planned for was the runaway hot air balloon. As a grand finale to their romantic countryside wedding, Olivia's father had arranged for a surprise balloon ride for the couple. The plan, right after they said "I do," they'd board a beautiful pastel-colored hot air balloon and float gracefully into the sky while the guests cheered below. It was supposed to be picture perfect. The ceremony was flawless. Vows were exchanged, happy tears were shed, and the guests erupted in applause. As planned, the balloon pilot signaled for the couple to board. The basket rocked slightly as Olivia and James stepped in, waving excitedly at their family and friends. Then, the wind picked up. Before the pilot could fully secure the ropes, a sudden gust sent the balloon lurching forward. The ground crew shouted and lunged for the ropes, but missed. The balloon, meant to be gently guided up, shot into the sky like a rogue rocket. With no pilot, the guests screamed. Olivia and James, now several feet off the ground and rising fast, clung to the edge of the basket. Is this supposed to happen? Olivia asked, her veil whipping in the wind. I don't think so, James yelled, frantically looking for controls, only to find none. Below, the wedding party descended into full chaos. The wedding planner fainted. Olivia's mother was screaming at the balloon crew. The best man grabbed a pair of binoculars as if that would somehow help. Meanwhile, the couple was now soaring over the sunflower fields. Like, this is not how I imagined leaving our wedding, Olivia cried. James, still gripping the side of the basket, tried to stay calm. Okay, it's fine. Balloons come down eventually, right? Gravity exists. Unfortunately, the wind had other plans. For 15 heart-pounding minutes, the balloon drifted wildly, carrying them over forests, roads, and what looked suspiciously like a cow pasture. Then, finally, they spotted a lake. Realizing they might be up there forever if they didn't act, James took a deep breath and made a decision. Hold on to me, he said, and with one swift move, he yanked the emergency parachute valve. The balloon plummeted, not gracefully, not romantically, but in a screaming, panicked freefall. With a massive splash, the basket landed straight into the shallow lake, drenching them both from head to toe. Back at the wedding venue, guests were losing their minds. Someone had called the fire department. Others had set off on foot, chasing the balloon's path. By the time help arrived, they found a soaked, laughing Olivia and James floating in a basket full of wedding decorations. As they were pulled to shore, Olivia turned to James, hair dripping, dress ruined, and said, "Well, at least we made a grand exit." James grinned. "A best wedding ever." And that night, instead of dancing at the reception, they told the craziest wedding story ever, over campfires, soggy clothes, and endless laughter. Story 13. No one expected the wedding to turn into a polar survival story, least of all the bride and groom. Samantha and Ethan had chosen a beautiful ice hotel in the Arctic as their wedding venue, something unique, magical, and unforgettable. And it was, but not for the reasons they imagined. The ceremony took place inside a breathtaking ice chapel, with walls, chairs, and even the altar carved from solid ice. The guests were bundled in elegant fur-lined coats, sipping hot cocoa while Samantha walked down the aisle, her gown sparkling like frost in the dim candlelight. It was perfect. Until the storm hit. As the newlyweds kissed, a deep, low rumble echoed through the icy halls. At first, they thought it was just the wind outside. But then one of the hotel staff rushed in, pale as a ghost. Blizzard incoming, and it's worse than expected. Everyone turned toward the entrance where thick sheets of snow were already piling against the door. The wind howled like a wild beast, and within minutes, visibility outside dropped to zero. The hotel manager made an announcement. "Nobody is leaving. We're officially snowed in." Cue panic. Guests in heels and tuxedos were suddenly stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no way out and no phone signal. The best man tried waving his phone around, but the cold killed the battery instantly. Samantha turned to Ethan, still holding her bouquet. "Did we just get married in an ice prison?" And that's when the power went out. Now, trapped inside an all-ice structure, the temperature plummeted. The candlelit glow became their only source of light, and guests started huddling together for warmth. The chef, ever the professional, announced that he would be serving the entire wedding menu immediately, because if they didn't eat it now, it would freeze solid. People grabbed plates of fancy Arctic cuisine, stuffing their faces while wrapped in blankets. Meanwhile, the flower girl, unbothered by the emergency, started sliding around the icy floor like it was a playground. The highlight? The officiant, still in full priestly attire, challenging the groomsmen to an ice sculpting contest using leftover decorations. Hours passed, and just as people started considering whether they'd have to sleep on frozen benches, the storm miraculously cleared. As rescue teams finally arrived, Samantha and Ethan looked at their shivering guests and laughed. Well, we wanted an unforgettable wedding, and unforgettable it was because how many people can say they survived their own wedding? Story 14. Everyone thought an underwater wedding was a crazy idea, but for Lily and Noah, two passionate scuba divers, it was a dream come true. They had planned everything: a crystal-clear tropical lagoon, an officiant in full diving gear, and vows exchanged with waterproof slates. What they hadn't planned for was the shark. The ceremony started off perfect. The guests, either in boats or scuba gear, watched as the couple descended into the lagoon, surrounded by vibrant coral and schools of colorful fish. The underwater chapel, a natural rock formation, was decorated with floating ribbons, and even the officiant had mastered the art of writing vows on a slate while wearing an oxygen tank. Lily and Noah held hands, bubbles rising around them as they signed their underwater marriage certificate. Then, suddenly, one of the guests froze and pointed behind them. Something huge was moving in the distance. A shark. At first, it was just a shadow. But as it glided closer, the shape became unmistakable. A sleek, 6-foot-long reef shark, cruising directly toward the wedding party. Cue Panic, one of Noah's uncles who had zero scuba experience and had only come for the novelty, started flailing wildly, kicking up sand and scaring every fish in sight. Another guest, forgetting they were underwater, tried to scream, which resulted in them accidentally inhaling water and signaling frantically for help. Lily's maid of honor? Gone. She swam straight for the surface faster than anyone had ever seen. Meanwhile, the officiant, who was apparently the coolest person alive, just gave the shark a polite nod and kept writing the vows. Noah turned to Lily, wide-eyed. Is this part of the ceremony? He scribbled on his slate. Lily, still holding her bouquet of waterproof flowers, responded, I think we just got a very large wedding crasher. The shark, uninterested in the chaos, glided right past them, completely ignoring the entire wedding. It wasn't there to attack, it was just curious. Within minutes, the giant fish disappeared into the blue, leaving behind a bunch of panicked, oxygen-deprived wedding guests, one hyperventilating uncle, and a couple who could not stop laughing. As they resurfaced, ripping off their masks, the first thing Noah shouted was, well, that was dramatic. Lily, breathless from laughing, wiped water from her face and said, hey, at least it didn't object. The guests, still recovering, roared with laughter. The officiant, completely unbothered, simply shrugged and said, so, should we finish this? And that's how Lily and Noah got married with a shark as an unexpected guest, making their underwater wedding even more legendary than they ever imagined. Story 15. Most people want their wedding to feel like a fairy tale. Grace and Oliver actually got, just not in the way they expected. They had chosen a stunning ancient forest for their outdoor ceremony. Tall, moss-covered trees stretched toward the sky. Fireflies danced in the twilight, and the wooden arch was decorated with twinkling fairy lights. It felt like something out of a dream, until the wild boars arrived. Everything started perfect. Grace walked down the aisle, looking like a woodland princess. Oliver wiped away a tear as he watched her approach. The guests were enchanted, whispering about how magical it all felt. Then, a loud snorting sound came from the trees. The officiant paused. The guests looked around. Grace and Oliver exchanged a confused glance. Then, rustling. A lot of it. Suddenly, a pack of wild boars burst out of the undergrowth, charging straight through the wedding. Cue instant chaos. The flower girl screamed and dropped her basket. The best man, who had been holding back tears during the vows, bolted up a tree like a professional rock climber. Guests jumped onto chairs. The violinist, in a moment of pure survival instinct, used his instrument as a shield. And the cake? Gone. One of the larger boars slammed into the table, sending the 3-tier masterpiece crashing into the dirt. Grace, standing in the middle of the chaos, still clutching her bouquet, gasped in horror. Ours! Our cake! Oliver grabbed her hand and shouted, love of my life, priorities. Meanwhile, the officiant, who must have seen everything in his career, sighed, adjusted his glasses, and kept reading the vows as if nothing was happening. Do you, Oliver, take Grace to be your lawfully wedded? Are we just ignoring the boars? Someone shouted from the back. Finally, after knocking over half the chairs, the boars lost interest and disappeared back into the trees as suddenly as they had arrived. The clearing fell silent, except for the sound of guests catching their breath. After a long pause, the officiant adjusted his papers and said, right, where were we? And just like that, the wedding continued. Later, as they sat on a log eating cupcakes, the only dessert that survived, Oliver turned to Grace and grinned. So, does this make us the king and queen of the forest now? Grace, still picking leaves out of her veil, laughed and said, at least we know we can survive anything together. And with that, their wildly unexpected, absolutely unforgettable wedding was complete. Story 16. Some weddings have unexpected guests, but Mia and Liam's wedding took that to a whole new level. They had chosen a stunning clifftop villa overlooking the ocean. The sunset was golden, the waves crashed below, and the gentle sea breeze made everything feel like a dream. And then, the monkey army arrived. It started innocently enough. As the couple exchanged vows, a single curious monkey appeared on the stone wall behind them. It tilted its head, watching the ceremony like an invited guest. The crowd chuckled. Then came another, and another. Within minutes, at least 20 monkeys had climbed down from the trees surrounding the wedding area. Cue nervous whispers. The officiant cleared his throat and continued. Do you, Liam, take Mia? And that's when the first monkey made a move. With incredible precision, it swiped the maid of honor's bouquet and bolted. Screams. Laughter. Panic. Hey! "That's mine!" she shrieked, chasing after it in heels. Before anyone could react, the rest of the monkeys took that as a signal and launched into full-on heist mode. One monkey grabbed a plate of hors d'oeuvres. Another ran off with the wedding veil. The best man tried to protect the champagne tower, only to have a monkey land on his head and steal his sunglasses. Then came the cake disaster. The couple's breathtaking 5-tier cake was positioned beautifully near the edge of the terrace. Two monkeys locked eyes with it, and before anyone could stop them, they leaped onto the table and shoved it straight off the cliff. The entire wedding party watched in horror as their perfect cake plummeted into the ocean. Mia gasped. Liam stood there, speechless. Then the officiant, without missing a beat, muttered, "Well, I guess that's one way to do a cake smash." And just like that, the tension snapped. Liam burst into laughter. Mia doubled over, wheezing. The guests, still recovering from the chaos, started cheering. Even the maid of honor, now holding a new bouquet made of stolen napkins, couldn't stop laughing. The monkeys, having successfully looted the wedding, retreated back into the trees, leaving behind a completely wrecked reception and a bunch of guests who had just witnessed history. With no cake, no veil, and half the appetizers missing, Mia turned to Liam and said, "So, should we just get married before they come back?" Liam grinned. "Absolutely." And right there, surrounded by giggling guests, ocean waves, and a gang of satisfied monkeys, they officially tied the knot. Story 17. A wedding in the desert sounded like a magical idea. Golden dunes, a breathtaking sunset, and a sky full of stars. Sophia and Ryan had planned everything perfectly. A beautiful Bedouin-style tent, soft lanterns glowing in the twilight, and the distant sound of traditional music. What they hadn't planned for was the camel stampede. The ceremony was flawless. The couple exchanged vows under a stunning flower arch as the last rays of sunlight bathed the dunes in orange and pink. The guests, dressed in flowing desert attire, clapped and cheered as Sophia and Ryan shared their first kiss as husband and wife. Then came the camels. At first, there was just one. A large, slightly grumpy-looking camel strolled past the edge of the wedding tent, chewing lazily on something. The guests awed and snapped pictures. Then another and another. Within minutes, a whole caravan of at least 15 camels had wandered straight into the wedding area. Cue mild panic. The camels, uninterested in the wedding itself, marched straight toward the buffet table. A waiter, frozen in horror, barely had time to react before one particularly determined camel shoved its head into the dessert section and started devouring the wedding cake. Screams erupted. The chef, in a last-ditch effort to save his masterpiece, waved a ladle like a sword, but the camel didn't care. Meanwhile, another camel decided that the decorative pillows inside the tent looked comfortable and flopped down in the middle of the dance floor, refusing to move. The best man, in full survival mode, shouted, "Don't make eye contact! I read they can spit!" Guests ran in every direction, some climbing onto chairs, others using their napkins as shields. The flower girl, completely unfazed, was now petting one of the camels like it was a giant puppy. Ryan grabbed Sophia's hand. Do we do something?" Sophia, watching as a camel casually knocked over the champagne tower, sighed. "I think we just let it happen." And so, the couple stood there, hand in hand, laughing hysterically as their wedding turned into a desert wildlife document. Eventually, the camel wrangler, who had been asleep under a tree this whole time, came running in with a bucket of dates, successfully luring the stampede away. As the dust settled, Sophia looked at the half-eaten cake, the overturned tables, and the exhausted guests and said, "Well, at least we can say our wedding was unforgettable." Ryan smirked, and apparently, Camel approved. And with that, they danced the night away, on a sand-covered dance floor, under a starry sky with the occasional distant camel grunt in the background. Story 18. Not every wedding ends with fireworks, but Emily and Jason's wedding almost started with an explosion. They had chosen a cozy vineyard for their big day, with rolling green hills, rows of grapevines, and a warm summer breeze. The ceremony was set to take place under a massive oak tree, and the reception area featured fairy lights, rustic tables, and, most importantly, an elegant wine fountain. What they didn't account for was the gas leak. The day started out perfect. Emily walked down the aisle, looking stunned, while Jason tried not to cry. They exchanged vows, the guests cheered, and everything felt like a dream. Then, as the reception kicked off, someone lit a cigar. It was Jason's uncle, a man who considered himself an expert on everything, including weddings. He leaned back in his chair, struck a match, and boom! A massive fireball erupted from the ground right next to the dance floor. Screams, glasses shattering, a waiter diving under a table. For a split second, no one knew what had happened. Then, as the smoke cleared, The vineyard owner, red-faced and panicked, sprinted toward the scene yelling, "No fire! There's a gas line under the lawn." Cue full-scale chaos. Guests scrambled to stomp out the small flames while Jason's uncle, whose eyebrows were now noticeably missing, stood in shock, still holding his cigar. Meanwhile, the wedding cake, perched beautifully on a nearby table, started tilting. Emily, still processing the near explosion, gasped as the cake tipped over. Jason lunged for it. The best man dived after. The photographer snapped pictures like his life depended on it. But nothing could stop it. The entire cake landed face first on Jason's arm, covering him in layers of buttercream and expensive font. For a long moment, silence. Then Emily, still in shock, muttered, "Well, at least nobody died?" Jason, wiping frosting off his suit, turned to his uncle, who was now a human wedding cake. "You okay?" The uncle blinked, licked some frosting off his lips, and said, "Honestly, this is delicious." The entire wedding erupted in laughter. The vineyard owner finally shut off the underground gas line, the flames were gone, and, somehow, the party continued. By the end of the night, guests were taking turns posing next to the charred grass patch. The best man gave a speech about love surviving literal fire, and Emily and Jason danced barefoot on the lawn, still laughing. Because while no one got to enjoy the cake, the wedding was legendary. Story 19. Most couples worry about rain on their wedding day. Emma and Luke got a tornado. They had planned the perfect barn wedding. Rustic wooden tables, string lights hanging from the rafters, and a dance floor under the open sky. The weather was supposed to be perfect, warm with a light breeze. It started off that way. Guests arrived, sipped lemonade, and admired the beautiful setup. Emma walked down the aisle as Luke's eyes filled with tears. They exchanged vows under an arch of wildflowers, and as the officiant said, "You may now kiss the bride," everyone cheered. Then someone pointed at the horizon. A dark funnel cloud was forming in the distance. At first, people thought it was far away. No reason to panic. But within minutes, the wind picked up. The string lights swung violently. Napkins and decorations flew off the tables, and the horses in the nearby field started running. Should we go inside?" someone asked. Then, the sirens went off. Full, blown, panic. The best man grabbed the cake, running toward the barn like it was a football. The flower girl screamed and dove under a table. One guest, convinced he could outrun a tornado, took off sprinting toward his car, only to be tackled by the wedding planner. Emma, veil whipping in the wind, yelled over the chaos. "Everyone into the barn." As guests scrambled inside, the wind ripped the reception tent straight out of the ground. Plates shattered. Chairs flew into the air like they had been launched from a cannon. Luke grabbed Emma's hand, pulling her toward the barn doors just as the sky turned. The officiant, still clutching his Bible, yelled, "I've never done a wedding and an evacuation at the same time." Inside, people huddled together, watching as the storm raged outside. And then, just as fast as it had started, it was over. The guests stepped outside to find half the wedding setup gone. The tables scattered across the field. The gift table, now in a tree. The cake, miraculously still intact. Emma turned to Luke, hair wild, dress covered in dust. "Well, I wanted a dramatic love story." Luke grinned. And now we have one." The DJ, now covered in leaves, shrugged and turned the music back on. And just like that, the party continued. Because if they could survive a tornado together, they could survive anything. Story 20. Some weddings are unforgettable because of the romance. Claire and Ben's wedding was unforgettable because of the explosion. They had chosen a stunning vineyard estate with rolling hills, twinkling fairy lights, and an outdoor fireplace for a cozy evening reception. It was supposed to be elegant, intimate, and absolutely perfect. Everything started smooth. Claire looked stunning as she walked down the aisle. Ben teared up as he read his vows. The guests clapped and cheered when they kissed. It was all storybook perfect. Until the fireworks show went wrong. Claire's father, wanting to surprise the couple, had arranged for a small fireworks display to go off at the exact moment of their first dance. A beautiful, romantic gesture. Except the guy in charge of setting them off miscalculated. The music started, Claire and Ben stepped onto the dance floor, and just as they gazed into each other's eyes, boom! Not in the sky. Not above the vineyard. Right next to the reception tent. Screams. Total chaos. A waiter threw himself behind a table. The maid of honor spilled red wine all over herself. The flower girl straight up vanished under the dessert table. Claire and Ben, frozen in shock, turned to see that the fireworks had ignited a pile of dry grass. Within seconds, a small fire had started spreading toward the buffet. Cue full-scale panic. Guests grabbed champagne buckets and started throwing Prosecco at the flames. Someone ripped off their suit jacket and tried to beat the fire out. The best man, holding a massive charcuterie board, yelled, "Does cheese stop fire?" Meanwhile, the wedding planner, who had clearly seen it all, just sighed, grabbed a fire extinguisher, and handled it like a pro. Within minutes, the flames were gone. The vineyard was safe. The guests were shaken but alive. And then, silence. Everyone turned to Claire and Ben, waiting for their reaction. Ben, covered in ash, turned to Claire, still gripping his hand. He blinked, took a deep breath, and said, "Well, babe, we wanted sparks." Claire, staring at her half-burned bouquet, burst into laughter. That was it. The tension snapped. The guests cheered. The DJ, probably in shock, hit play on the music again. And just like that, the party continued. That night, as they sat together, sipping wine and watching the slightly scorched remains of the reception area, Claire leaned her head on Ben's shoulder and whispered, "We are never topping this anniversary." And she was absolutely right.